February 14th, 1933. Al Capone was outnumbered 12-1. Bugs Moran had sent his deadliest crew. Not outsiders, not unknown street punks. These were men who had grown up in the shadows of Chicago's underworld. Men who had killed before and would kill again without hesitation. Capone's own former associates, men who knew his habits, his routines, his arrogance. 12 killers, hand-picked. Names whispered in speakeasies and police files alike. Men even the cops preferred not to arrest, because arresting them usually meant funerals afterward. They cornered Al Capone in a basement on the south side of Chicago. No witnesses, no way out. Capone was 34 years old, at the height of his power, yet still surrounded by enemies who believed his reign was temporary. Bugs Moran was the last serious rival standing in Chicago. Everyone expected the same ending. Al Capone, dead in a basement. Another body added to the city's long list of unsolved murders. But what Bugs Moran didn't know, what nobody fully understood yet, was that Al Capone didn't play by anybody's rules. 90 minutes later, only one of those 12 men walked out alive. And he carried a message that made Bugs Moran, who had survived shootouts, betrayals, and the St. Valentine's Day massacre itself, go completely silent. This is the story of the night Al Capone became untouchable. By February of 1933, Capone's name had become a constant presence in the city. You didn't have to see him to feel him. His influence showed up in which bars stayed open, which unions won strikes, which businesses survived inspections that ruined others. Police officers pretended not to notice certain cars. Judges postponed certain cases indefinitely. Capone never corrected people who called him reckless. He let them believe it. Recklessness was predictable. Intelligence was not. Those close to him knew the truth. Capone prepared for everything. He studied people the way other men studied, ledgers. Who spoke too fast? Who avoided eye contact? Who laughed when they were nervous? He remembered slights that others dismissed and favors that others forgot. Nothing disappeared with him. It was all cataloged. Bugs Moran, on the other hand, still believed in force. Moran had come up in a Chicago where survival depended on who pulled the trigger first. He had outlasted rivals, escaped ambushes, buried friends, and rebuilt again and again. But age and pressure were closing in. The city was changing, and Moran was changing with it, harder, angrier, less patient. Where Capone consolidated, Moran lashed out. The North Side felt smaller every month. Streets Moran once controlled now answered to someone else. Men who once checked in weekly stopped showing up. Money dried up. And worst of all, respect evaporated quietly, without confrontation. Moran blamed Capone for all of it. Not because Capone attacked him directly, but because he didn't have to. That infuriated Moran more than any gunfight ever had. Capone had made himself unavoidable. The kind of man you couldn't remove without tearing the city apart. Moran saw that and understood something else just as clearly. If Capone wasn't stopped soon, he never would be. That was when the idea took shape. Not a war. Wars were expensive, loud, unpredictable. This would be clean, quick, final. Moran didn't need Capone humiliated in court or crippled by police pressure. He needed him erased in a way that made sense to the underworld. A quiet ending in a place where no one asked questions. A disappearance that everyone understood without explanation. A basement. Basements were where Chicago settled its business. Where voices didn't carry. Where mistakes didn't reach daylight. Where men went in one way and sometimes didn't come out at all. Capone knew all this too. That was the part people misunderstood later. They assumed he was careless that night, that arrogance had finally caught up with him, that he walked into danger because he believed himself untouchable. The truth was more complicated. Capone had been watching Moran closely. The missed meetings, the sudden movements, the unusual silences. Moran wasn't subtle when he was cornered. He telegraphed desperation the same way others telegraphed confidence. Capone saw it coming. What he didn't do was avoid it. There was a difference. Avoiding danger kept you alive. Facing it on your terms kept you powerful. Capone understood that fear grew fastest in uncertainty. If Moran made a move and Capone disappeared for a few days, rumors would explode. Weakness would be imagined. Challenges would follow. Power didn't survive that kind of vacuum, so Capone stayed visible. He drank in public, met associates openly, moved through familiar spaces. He allowed the city to believe he was comfortable, predictable, unchanged. That was the trap. When the tip came in about movement near the warehouse, Capone didn't react emotionally. He didn't rush. He didn't warn anyone loudly. He simply adjusted his schedule and went himself, alone. Not because he lacked protection, because protection attracts attention, and attention ruins timing. The warehouse basement had always been a neutral space, a place Capone used because it didn't announce itself. No signs, no luxury, just function. Crates, tables, a single bulb that had been replaced more times than anyone could remember. Capone had stood in that basement many nights before, counting money, listening to arguments, ending them. He knew how sound moved there, how light behaved, where footsteps echoed and where they disappeared. He knew exactly what kind of place it was. And he knew exactly what kind of place Moran would choose. When Capone descended the stairs that morning, he wasn't thinking about survival. He was thinking about resolution, about ending a question that had lingered too long over Chicago. He wasn't walking into a walking trap. He was closing a chapter. Moran finalized the plan in silence. He didn't call meetings. He didn't write anything down. He selected the men personally, one by one, based on a single requirement. They had to be capable of killing Capone without hesitation. Loyalty didn't matter. Survivability didn't matter. Only follow-through. 12 men, not friends, not brothers, just tools. Each was told only what he needed to know. The location, the timing, the signal. No one was told the full picture. Moran understood that fear multiplied when men compared notes. The message was simple. Capone would be alone. That detail mattered. Capone's reputation rested on his organization, his layers, his buffers, his ability to make problems disappear without being present. Strip that away, and he was just a man. Flesh, bone, breath. Moran wanted the myth broken. The men were instructed to wait in the basement, lights low, guns ready, no talking once Capone arrived, no warnings, no negotiations. The job was to end fast and end quietly. Moran did not attend. That was deliberate. Leaders who watched their enemies die tended to grow careless afterward. Moran wanted distance. He wanted to hear the result, not witness it. While Moran waited, Capone moved through the city unaware or appearing to be. That distinction mattered. Capone drove himself part of the way, then walked. He liked walking. It let him think, let him feel the city. The way the air changed block to block. The way silence carried different meanings depending on the street. Chicago before dawn felt honest. No crowds, no performances, just brick, steel, and breath. Capone replayed recent conversations in his head. The pauses, the tone shifts, the missing faces. None of it surprised him anymore. He had reached the point in power where silence meant action. He didn't carry visible weapons. That wasn't arrogance. That was intention. Weapons focused men on tools instead of space. Capone preferred space, distance, timing. He had learned long ago that violence wasn't about strength. It was about interruption, breaking rhythm, creating confusion. The basement stairs creaked under his weight. That sound was intentional too. Men waiting in ambush expected silence. When it didn't come, tension spiked, muscles tightened, breath shortened. That was when mistakes started. Capone stepped down slowly, letting the bulb above him sway. He wanted them alert. Alert men rushed. Rushing men made errors. When the guns revealed themselves, Capone counted without moving his head. He read posture the way other men read faces. He saw which hands shook, which shoulders were tight, which eyes darted toward exits. He already knew who would panic first. The voice that spoke Moran's name carried confidence but not certainty. Capone heard the difference immediately. Confidence stayed steady. Uncertainty cracked at the edges. Capone responded calmly, not because he felt calm, but because calm unsettled predators. It told them their advantage was miscalculated. The moment stretched. Men later said it felt unreal, like a pause before thunder. When Capone broke the light, everything accelerated. Darkness didn't just remove sight. It erased hierarchy. Orders lost authority. Men became individuals again, trapped inside their own fear. Capone moved before the first shot finished echoing. He stayed close to walls, close to bodies. He forced the fight inward. Wide swings missed. Close strikes landed. The basement amplified confusion. Footsteps sounded larger than they were. Breathing sounded like movement. One man fired twice and hit nothing. Another turned too sharply and lost balance. Capone used that second. That fraction of a second where gravity decided more than intention. He didn't pursue fleeing men, he intercepted. Pain traveled faster than information. Men learned something was wrong only when they were already falling. The guns became liabilities. Muzzle flashes betrayed positions. Capone used those flashes like markers on a map. When someone shouted for the stairs, Capone smiled. That was the only exit. He repositioned without sound and waited. Bodies collided with him in the dark. He redirected weight, used momentum. Let physics finish arguments that fists started. The basement filled with groans, shattered wood, and panic-fed gunfire. More than one man fell to bullets never meant for him. When the noise finally burned itself out, Capone didn't rush. Silence after violence was dangerous. Men pretended, men waited. Capone listened until he was certain. Then he chose the survivor, not randomly. He picked the man whose fear had fully replaced his aggression. The one whose breathing came too fast. The one who would never want to come back. That was the man who would deliver the message. Capone placed the card in his hand, not as a threat, but as punctuation. Then he left. By the time the survivor began to crawl, the city above was already waking. Capone blended into it easily. Chicago never noticed the moment its balance tipped. By mid-morning, the city had begun to whisper. Not openly, not loudly. Chicago never did anything loudly when it came to real power. The whispers moved through barbershops, loading docks, union halls, and back offices. Men lowered their voices without knowing why. Others stopped mid-sentence when certain names came up. Something had happened. Police scanners crackled with fragments that didn't connect. Reports of gunfire that led nowhere. Ambulances called and canceled. A handful of men found injured, none willing to speak. No bodies reported officially, yet too much blood for nothing to have occurred. Capone's associates noticed first. They weren't told anything. Capone didn't call a meeting, didn't send word. But patterns shifted. Routes changed. Appointments were quietly rescheduled. Men who usually checked in twice a day were told to wait. Capone was resetting the board. He met his inner circle one at a time, never together. Each meeting was brief. Each man left with a different piece of responsibility. No one was given the whole picture. That was deliberate. Capone had learned long ago that power failed when too many people understood it fully. Fragmentation created resilience. If one part broke, the rest held. The men understood this instinctively. They didn't ask questions. They followed instructions and adjusted their own operations accordingly. Chicago's criminal infrastructure shifted in small, almost invisible ways. Meanwhile, on the north side, Bugs Moran sat in silence. The message had arrived. Not just the card, the absence. Phones didn't ring. Expected confirmations never came. The men he trusted most avoided his eyes. Even before the survivor reached him, Moran felt it in his gut. Something had gone wrong. When the door finally opened and the bloodied man collapsed inside, Moran already knew the truth. He had known it for hours. Still hearing it said aloud, and it changed something. He let me live. Those words settled heavily in the room. Moran understood what Capone had done. It wasn't mercy. It wasn't hesitation. It was strategy. Capone had controlled not just the violence, but the story that followed it. Moran's lieutenants argued. Voices rose. Plans were proposed. Retaliation mapped out in heated fragments. Moran listened without interrupting. Then he shut it down. Wars were loud. Wars attracted attention. Wars created openings for law enforcement, politicians, and opportunists. Wars consumed men faster than they replaced them. Capone had offered him an exit, not a surrender, an ending. Moran hated that most of all. Accepting it felt like weakness. Refusing it felt like suicide. So Moran chose survival. The north side didn't collapse overnight. It thinned. Deals moved elsewhere. Men defected quietly. Protection weakened. Moran remained dangerous but no longer dominant. Capone never acknowledged the shift publicly. He didn't need to. His presence alone became confirmation. Months passed. Then years. The basement incident was never written down correctly. Official reports contradicted each other. Witnesses changed stories. Evidence vanished. The truth fragmented into versions, each shaped by fear, loyalty, or imagination. That suited Capone perfectly. A single version could be challenged. A dozen versions could not. Stories grew teeth. They warned men away from reckless ambition. They reminded rivals that Capone didn't need to strike often, only decisively. By the late 1930s, young men entering Chicago's underworld didn't ask whether Capone was powerful. They asked when he would decide something. Because once Capone decided, outcomes followed. That was the legacy of that night. Not bloodshed. Control. Even as federal pressure mounted and Capone's public life narrowed, the private myth endured. Prison took his body, illness took his clarity, but the story outlived both. Men who had never seen Capone alive still lowered their voices when his name came up. Still referenced the basement as if it were a fixed point in history, a reminder. Power didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waited in the dark, and when it moved, it ended arguments forever. As weeks passed, the consequences of that night became clearer to those who knew how to read them. Capone's operations began to feel less reactive and more inevitable. Decisions that once took days were now resolved before questions formed. Associates noticed that Capone no longer debated outcomes. He anticipated them. He spoke in conclusions rather than plans. When disputes arose between crews, Capone settled them without meetings. A man would wake up reassigned. Another would find his territory quietly reduced. No explanations were offered. None were needed. Fear adjusted itself around efficiency. Capone also changed the way he moved. He became harder to predict, not by hiding, but by varying rhythm. One day visible, the next unreachable. One night out late, the next gone before dusk. Patterns dissolved. Surveillance became guesswork. Law enforcement noticed, but couldn't articulate why. Capone's public image still painted him as excessive, flamboyant, impulsive. That image worked in his favor. It kept attention on what he allowed people to see. Meanwhile, the real structure of his power became quieter and stronger. Associates learned not to test boundaries, not because of threats, but because of absence. Men who crossed lines didn't always disappear violently. Sometimes they simply stopped mattering. Their calls went unanswered. Their protection failed at critical moments. Their leverage evaporated. That was worse. Meanwhile, Bugs Moran lived with the echo of a decision he could never undo. He had chosen not to fight. Every morning after he woke knowing the city would never look at him the same way again. He was still dangerous, still capable of violence. But the moment had passed. Momentum had chosen its side. Men sensed it. They always did. Moran found himself surrounded by loyalty without faith. Men followed orders, but without urgency, without belief. That kind of loyalty cracked under pressure. He tried to rebuild, shift strategies, create new alliances. But Chicago had already moved on. Capone wasn't just stronger, he was settled, like gravity, like weather. Fighting him no longer felt like rebellion, it felt like denial. The basement incident became a point of reference. Men argued about it late at night, voices low. Each retelling changed details, but never the outcome. Capone entered. Capone left. Everything else was decoration. Some versions painted Capone as brutal, others as surgical. Some insisted he barely fought at all. That panic did the work for him. The truth was irrelevant. The effect was the same. Capone became the standard by which risk was measured. Before making a move, men asked themselves a single question. How would Capone respond? If the answer was unclear, they hesitated. That hesitation saved Capone more battles than gunfire ever did. Even those who hated him adapted. They learned to work around him, not against him. To exist in spaces he didn't care about. To survive by being uninteresting. Capone allowed that. He didn't seek total domination. Total domination bred resistance. He preferred selective control. Key points. Pressure valves. Leverage that didn't need constant reinforcement. Years later, when analysts tried to explain how Capone lasted as long as he did, they focused on corruption and money. They missed the human element. Capone understood fear, but he respected intelligence. He knew when to apply pressure and when to let it dissolve on its own. He knew when to strike and when to wait. And he knew that endings mattered more than beginnings. That night in the basement had been an ending. Not just for Moran's challenge, but for uncertainty itself. Chicago's underworld accepted a new constant. Not chaos, not peace, but order. defined by one man's willingness to control the moment when everything could fall apart. That understanding spread slowly, then all at once, and once it settled, it never left. Time has a way of clarifying things that chaos hides. In the months following the basement incident, Chicago's underworld began to settle into a new shape. It wasn't announced. No one declared allegiance. It happened through a series of small decisions made independently by men who believed they were acting alone. A delivery route was altered to avoid attention. A payoff was redirected without complaint. A dispute was settled quietly instead of publicly. Each decision seemed minor. Together they formed a pattern. Capone watched this pattern with interest. He didn't rush to claim credit. He didn't remind anyone of what he had done. The night in the basement was never mentioned by him or his associates. Silence protected the story better than repetition ever could. Capone understood something essential. Fear fades when it is explained. Mystery does not. He let men fill in the gaps themselves. Some imagined Capone had planned everything weeks in advance. Others believed he had simply adapted faster than anyone else in the room. A few insisted there were hidden men, locked doors, and signals that had never been discovered. Capone encouraged none of it. He benefited from all of it. His organization became less visible but more efficient. Layers thinned. Middlemen vanished. Orders traveled shorter distances. Fewer voices carried more weight. Mistakes dropped sharply. Capone's associates noticed the change but rarely discussed it. They sensed that whatever line had existed before had been crossed, and stepping back over it was no longer possible. Men who had once been ambitious now became cautious. Ambition attracted attention. Attention attracted consequences. Caution kept you alive. On the north side, Moran's world narrowed further. He still held territory, but it felt temporary, like borrowed ground. He knew every move he made was being measured against something he could no longer control. The city had shifted its expectations, and Moran no longer met them. Even victories felt hollow. When a deal went his way, it was treated as luck rather than skill. When violence succeeded, it was dismissed as noise. Capone's shadow stretched far enough to dull Moran's sharpest moments. That was the real defeat. Moran had lost the narrative. He tried to reclaim it through action. Small shows of force, strategic disruptions. But each attempt felt reactive rather than decisive. Capone didn't respond. He didn't need to. Ignoring a challenge sometimes weakened it more than confrontation. Capone's restraint became its own form of pressure. Rivals didn't know whether silence meant indifference or preparation. That uncertainty gnawed at them. Meanwhile, Capone invested his energy elsewhere. He studied how power decayed, how empires collapsed not from attack, but from complacency. He rotated responsibilities, forced trusted men to rest, encouraged dissent in private so it didn't explode in public. He remembered the feeling of standing in the dark, surrounded, listening to fear breathe. He never wanted to feel that again. The city felt it too. Chicago's criminal world became quieter, but not safer. Violence still existed, but it was contained, directed, purposeful. Random bloodshed attracted scrutiny, and scrutiny threatened everyone. Capone didn't outlaw chaos. He priced it out. Men who caused unnecessary problems found themselves unsupported. Protection failed them when it mattered. Allies distanced themselves instinctively. Chaos became expensive. Order became profitable. Years later, when men tried to trace the moment Chicago changed, they pointed to laws, arrests, elections, and economic shifts. Those explanations were convenient. The truth was simpler. One night, a man walked into a basement knowing exactly what could happen, and when he walked out, everyone else adjusted their expectations accordingly. That adjustment reshaped the city more thoroughly than any single act of violence ever could. Because once expectations change, behavior follows. And once behavior changes, power no longer needs to announce itself. It simply exists. With time, the basement stopped being a place and became a reference. Men spoke about it without naming it directly. After that night, since the stairs, when everything went quiet, the words shifted, but the meaning stayed the same. Something had been decided there, and no one wanted to be on the wrong side of it. Capone understood the value of that transformation. Places faded. Stories endured. He allowed the myth to evolve. Naturally, he never corrected exaggerations, never clarified contradictions. Letting different versions coexist ensured none could be challenged completely. Truth dissolved into atmosphere. You could feel it when you walked into certain rooms. Conversation slowed when Capone arrived, not out of fear, but recalibration. Men adjusted posture, tone, expectation. They weren't bracing for violence, they were bracing for judgment. That distinction mattered. Capone no longer needed to threaten. His silence carried weight. A delayed response felt heavier than a shouted order ever could. Men filled the gap with caution. This affected how decisions were made across the city. Disputes that once escalated to gunfire now stalled. Negotiations extended longer. Compromises appeared where none had before. Violence didn't disappear. It became intentional. Capone had changed the cost-benefit equation. On the rare occasions he intervened directly, it was surgical. A single conversation, a subtle reallocation. A reminder delivered without raising his voice. He didn't humiliate men publicly, he corrected them privately. That preserved loyalty. Those who worked under him learned something essential. Survival wasn't about aggression, but alignment. Knowing where power settled mattered more than how loud it spoke. Meanwhile, Moran watched history move without him. He remained part of the landscape, but no longer the weather. His name still carried weight, but it no longer decided outcomes. Younger men listened politely, then acted independently. That hurt more than opposition. Moran understood too late that the battle hadn't been lost in the basement. It had been lost in perception. Capone had controlled the ending so completely that everything afterward felt predetermined. Even Moran's restraint was interpreted as fear. There was no reclaiming that. As years passed, Capone's health declined, but the structure he had built held. Others managed daily operations, but the principles remained intact. The system didn't require constant reinforcement because it had adapted. Fear had evolved into expectation. When federal pressure finally tightened and Capone's physical presence diminished, the city didn't erupt into chaos. That surprised many, but it shouldn't have. Capone had already done the work. He had taught men how to behave when he wasn't there. That was the true mark of control. The basement incident faded into legend, but its influence remained active. Decisions still referenced it indirectly. Caution still traced back to it. The idea that one moment could reshape an entire ecosystem persisted. In that way, the night never really ended. It simply continued, stretching forward through choices made by men who had never seen the basement themselves, but felt its weight all the same. Power, once established at that depth, didn't vanish. It echoed. In the years that followed, men tried to locate the precise moment when Al Capone crossed from powerful to inevitable. Some pointed to money, others to political protection. A few cited fear alone. But those who had lived through it understood that inevitability was not built over time. It was declared in an instant and reinforced afterward. That instant had been the basement. Capone had not survived by chance. He had survived by understanding the psychology of violence better than anyone else in Chicago. He knew that men rarely failed because they lacked weapons. They failed because their expectations collapsed. In that room, 12 men had expected dominance. They had expected numbers to decide the outcome. When that expectation shattered, so did everything built on top of it. Capone didn't overpower them. He disoriented them. And disorientation, once introduced, spread faster than fear. From that point forward, Capone made fewer appearances but more decisions. He no longer needed visibility to maintain authority. His absence became informative. If Capone was quiet, it meant something was already in motion. Associates learned to read these signals. Silence meant patience. Delay meant assessment. Sudden clarity meant resolution had already occurred elsewhere. The organization adapted accordingly. Capone also became more selective with violence. Random brutality weakened systems. Directed pressure strengthened them. He used force sparingly, ensuring each action carried weight long after it ended. That restraint confused rivals. They expected escalation. Instead, they encountered indifference. They prepared for retaliation that never came, expending energy on threats that dissolved without response. Capone allowed his enemies to exhaust themselves. Bugs Moran, in particular, felt this erosion deeply. Every plan he conceived felt reactive. Every move seemed late. Even when Capone did nothing, Moran felt outpaced. The city had adjusted its internal compass. Capone was north. That realization settled into Chicago's criminal world slowly, then permanently. Men aligned their behavior not to avoid punishment, but to remain relevant. They adapted to Capone's presence the way businesses adapt to regulation, reluctantly at first, then instinctively. By the time Capone's legal troubles mounted, the damage, or the order, was already done. Removing the man did not remove the system. Others filled operational roles, but none altered the structure. Because the structure had been shaped by consequence. The basement incident was no longer discussed openly by then. It didn't need to be. Its lesson had diffused into habit. Men acted cautiously, without remembering why. That was its final form. Influence without memory. When historians later tried to explain Capone's dominance, they focused on spectacle, the suits, the headlines, the trials. They overlooked the quieter truth. Capone's greatest strength was not intimidation. It was finality. He ended questions. He closed loops. And when people understand how a story ends, they stop trying to rewrite it. February 14th, 1933. 12 men walked into a basement, 1 walked out, and Chicago was never the same. If this story hit you, smash that subscribe button. We're telling the Al Capone stories. History softened or forgot. The moments that built the legend. The code that made him untouchable. Drop a like if you think Capone was more than just muscle. And in the comments, what would you have done if you were Bugs Moran? More legendary stories coming next. Don't miss them.